appreciate it and appreciate your time. And this will go till 11:30, and then we'll hear from NOAA Fisheries at 11:30. So we'll do that, and then Miss Tana Engel will do our prayer for lunch. And then we are going to do honoring for our past ATNI Executive Board meetings during lunch, which is hosted by our friends from Cowlitz. So we're going to honor Kat Brigham and Andy Joseph and Ann Sargent is from there. And Mel is unable to join us today. So it's our language panel here too. So welcome everyone. Mr. Brian Gunn, it's all yours.
All right, without further ado, I'm Brian Gunn here. I'm the moderator of this panel and happy to be up here again. And luckily I don't have to do any heavy lifting, I don't think, because we have some great panelists to talk about languages. The way this panel came about is there was some tribal leader interest in developing a strategy and hearing what other tribes are doing to really make the federal government live up to its obligation of funding native languages in a way that's base funding and not having to compete for it. And that's kind of what we're hoping to talk about today, as well as get an idea about some of the other tribes and tribal language programs around the Northwest are doing. So I think what I'll do is have the panelists introduce themselves. So why don't we start with Jefferson? We'll just go down the list in the agenda. Maybe just introduce yourselves, give a little brief bio, and then we'll move on down the list.
Nich mais git lachma, nich ma das kenu und kopaya ma das koltanama pa muyana we ATNI au wapata das ku wapsuchtas ana masliki tatawa khan khaichan ti champa Mike nicht tananma na miyanashma pa kenu kham stamanwa ana masliki tatawa khan kha Mike nicht tananma en mi wanich tanantumt kinaswa isu ku siapatumt ki wa Jefferson Green Warm Springs kane ko nami naimo ma kon khtaima pawa inchewana kane ko takhspash wakhpushpal nemipo ko wasko. And in a foreign language, hello, I am Jefferson Green, and I'm from Warm Springs, and I've been working in language revitalization since 2005, the first time I picked up a drum, and I've been working there ever since. I worked for the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs up until 2019, and that's when some elders and I decided, let's try another avenue for revitalizing language. And so we started the Columbia River Institute for Indigenous Development Foundation, the Creed Foundation, and started partnering with as many elders in the Columbia Plateau as we could to begin documenting and archiving as much of the language as possible. And then I'm glad we had started that back in 2014 to be exact, because then sadly COVID came and took out sadly about 30-something of our elders. And so we've been able to archive their words and their corrections and their history. So thank you.
Kastisquistam, Hisquisquas, and we Sitqua, Chishistiamch. Good morning, everyone. My name is Norma Jean Louis. I'm a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe. My Indian name is Senwiwe Sitqua, Bird on Swirling Water, and I am the director of our culture, language, and TIPO programs for the Coeur d'Alene tribe. And welcome to all of you. Lim Limsh.
My name is Karen Connon, and the Vice Chair for the Confederate Tribes of the Caldwell Reservation. I was initially the language manager for the Caldwell Tribes Language and Archives Records Manager, beginning in December 19, 2000. I was elected to council and left that position in 2007, returned to council March 9th, 2018, and I've been the vice chair since early last year. So welcome everybody, and I look forward to providing some historical background on language preservation in Washington State. Lim Limt.
Knox, Iltits Kech, Sensation Squats, Josh, Katok, Chalt, Pomich. Good morning, everyone. My name's Josh. I'm the linguist for the Cowlitz tribe. Currently working on really building up the Cowlitz language program. Good morning.
Before the panelists get started with their remarks, I wanted to just mention an anecdote that I had recently with Eric Eberhard. Some of you know him. He's the Indian law professor at the University of Washington, and we were talking about sort of olden days. He was mentioning that back in the 1990s, when he was the staff director for the Indian Affairs Committee, he was talking to then Senator Joe Biden, who was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And he was talking with them about the need to have federal funding to allow, and jurisdictional fixes to allow Indian tribes to have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians in the domestic violence context. So this was sort of the very, very first discussions about VAWA, like a tribal fix for VAWA in the 1990s. And what he said is that Biden at that time said that he was totally supportive. He says, but you need data. He says, I will help you, but you need data to help me essentially help you. And Eric was talking about in the ensuing years how they worked with tribes to develop the best argument to make this fix and to get funding, which initially started with grants and then became more formulaic. So it's kind of with that's the way I'm kind of thinking about this, but I'm interested in hearing about the perspectives from the experts up here about tribal language programs and things that they've seen that have worked, things that might be applicable to other tribes, or just recommendations or observations that they might have generally about native languages. So with that, maybe I'll just start with, we have one more introduction. I'm sorry, go ahead.
My name is Dixie Stenskar. I'm with the Coeur d'Alene tribe. My name comes from my Moctolmy family. I've been involved in our culture, language, and history for many, many years. And I believe that our language is at the core of who we are as Indigenous people. And I think that this language summit is long awaited and long coming, however it's said. But it's something that I feel is really important, and it's at my heart. It's who we are as Indigenous people, and the piecemeal that they've been trying to give the tribes to the dollars to revitalize, preserve, or do immersion programs isn't enough. I think they owe more than just that because of the policies that they enacted to assimilate us. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm glad the momentum's picked up where it's on the floor instead of just in committee. And I really hope you take these guys' words and the wheels rolling seriously and get involved. We're having a language summit next week in Palm Springs with the NIEA. And I think all our organizations need to be a huge part of this through resolution or other forms. So Lim Lumshin, welcome. Thank you for listening.
Why don't we start with Jefferson and have you give your presentation, then we'll move on down the list.
Sure. I could give a long PowerPoint and from the beginning to end, starting in the 1400s, but I'll just save you a little bit of time on that. You know, when I first started well, I guess I'm born and raised on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation, and I grew up in and around our longhouse, and participating so much, you begin to acquire these songs, and they just kind of stick with you. And they would explain the songs in the language, and I wasn't too rounded in the language at that time, and most of the elders spoke to me in English. But over so many years, these songs just were embedded into many, many of the children of that era that are still singing songs today. And then after I lost my grandparents, I went to college, and when I came back from school, there was still a strong interest to keep our culture strong and alive, and so I would still go to the longhouse in sorts. But what I found myself doing was I was repeating a lot of the same songs from childhood, and some other students wanted to learn those songs as well. And not knowing the language, sometimes people in our community would say, "Do you know what you're singing about?" And it would catch me off guard because it was the truth that I didn't actually know the interpretations of the songs that I was singing. And so, but it kind of lit a fire, and I wanted to know more. And so I started to go to the language program to meet with our elders and say, hey, these songs that we sing today, that there's hundreds of us that sing these songs, and I'm wanting to know more about what they're talking about. And so that was my beginning. And so in 2005, when I started drumming and getting the translations directly from our elders to help me along so that I can be a better servant to our community. And then eventually they'd say, well, you come to the language class, you ask about songs, you should get a job here. And so I went ahead and got a job with the language department, and I was acquiring so many words, right? An incredible amount of vocabulary. I remember learning every single animal in our language that you could think of. But I felt like I was still short though, because I couldn't say a single sentence. I could name beaver, I could name birds and dogs and everything you can think of, right? And I was a little discouraged because I was then there for a few months and I could just name every animal. But I happened to end up at a ceremony and they were giving out an Indian name. And they pointed me out in the crowd and they're like, hey, Jefferson is here. Ask him. He works at the language program. So I ended up getting put on the spot, and they pulled me over to the front, and they're like, hey, we're trying to think of an Indian name, and we remember Grandma said that she's going to be a bird, but we don't know what bird. What are all the bird names? I was like, I don't want to go through all the bird names. I mean, do you have any idea? And they're like, well, do you know how to say owl? And I was like, pipu. No, it wasn't that. Do you remember? What about hawk? What's the word for hawk? Kumsali? Oh, that's hummingbird. No, ilush is hawk. No, it's not that either. Maybe it's eagle. How do you say eagle? Huayama? No, it's not that. What about, how do you say dove? Mimim. Oh, that's it. That's the word. That's the word. And that's when that fire got even stronger. I mean, it's like, dang, I would have never thought I'd have to know all these animals, right, at some point that I still couldn't say sentences for. But then I went back to work and I was like, I really need to learn how to speak and really conjugate and explain things in different contexts. And that was the beginning to an extensive curriculum and archive for our language. And we've put every single word you can think of into this archive with the help of our elders from Warm Springs, and we expanded beyond into Yakima and into Umatilla, and we have the largest digital database that we have in our offices. So that's a little bit about it, not to take too much time, but thank you.
Forget, you gotta hold the green button. Just as a, to bring you up to date, at Cow Creek during mid-year, the topic for the tribal leaders was our language. And so the tribal leaders that were present discussed and told us stories about what was happening with each of their tribes and what was happening on their reservations as far as the loss of language, the loss of fluent speakers, and how they were working on developing programs for the languages in their schools. And so what came out of that was holding the government liable, federal mandates, mandatory funding and apology, mandatory funding for all tribes, non-competitive for the Northwest region, the ATNI tribes. Tribes may be at different levels in their teaching, as we know that many of us have lost our fluent speakers. However, we do have recordings of their language. And now we have our Native American students that have received their BAs or masters, but they're working on computerized programs with our language taken from those recordings. So many of our tribes are progressing in a good way to maintaining that language. Saying that tribes may be at different levels, and funding for the BIA schools and the public schools on all of our reservations. The history of the language loss is that the Native Americans, from a reading that I have, Native Americans lost control of education of their children when the United States government forcibly enrolled them in residential schools designed for assimilation into an American mold. This policy began in the 1870s and continued on a large scale through the 1970s. A few schools are still operating today in these institutions. Children were severely punished, both physically and psychologically, for using their own languages instead of English. These experiences convinced entire generations of Native people that their children would be better off learning to speak only English. Hoping to spare their children the pain they once went through, parents stopped passing their languages on to their children and thereby stopped creating fluent speakers of those languages. As a result, numerous languages indigenous to America are now severely in danger of losing their last native speakers. So this is why this topic was brought up at the last ATNI meeting, was to bring awareness to the federal government to take some action. All of our language programs require dollars in order to proceed to protect and preserve their languages. So this is one of the reasons why we are here and bringing this to your attention today. Limlimsh.
I was just kind of volunteered to be up here, so I'm shooting it from the hip here. But yesterday, I seen a lot of us wearing orange, and the significance behind that orange shirt is every child matters, no children. There shouldn't be graveyards at a residential school or any school. And the significance of that orange is that our kids, we look at our grandkids, we look at our great-grandkids, our little people that are wandering around, our little humans that were forcibly taken from their homes because of a policy of kill the Indian and save the man. And that went on for a number of years. I think I was the first day scholar at the Mary Immaculate boarding school when they shut down the actual boarding. And their whole policy was to do away with our songs, our language, our way of life, the way we raised our kids, the way our community took care of one another, all those thoughts, all our worldview, our lifestyle. That was their intention. And in our language is really it's a worldview. It's the way we see things. And to have that taken for those generations is, it's assimilation is a nice word, genocide is better. And then to, with self-determination and all those acts that came up, but nobody's talking about the language. They give A&A funding and they say, okay, tribes, here's a bone, you guys fight for it to preserve your language. Preserve your way of life, preserve your culture. It isn't working. It's piecemeal. And we've got the next generations to look out for. That's the way our ancestors viewed our world, was the next generations. What's going to happen 7 generations down the road? I'm the 5th generation away from the forced move from our rivers, from our lakes. What's going to happen in the next 7 generations? Are they going to know their songs? Are they going to be able to greet in language? Are they going to know ceremony? Go to the longhouse, sweat, sing those songs in our language. Those things are our identity. That's who we are. And, these meetings and talking about all, everything that we need to keep our language and our culture up there as well. We can't forget who we are or where we came from. And it's just, out my heart. And my parents went to boarding schools, my grandparents. She did. But I just really hope that people take it to heart and remember who you are. We come to Indigenous conferences and everything's important. Everything's at the forefront. Everything needs to be taken care of. But don't forget your language and your culture while you're pushing all those other things. So, my little story in Lim Lunch.
So if given enough time, I'll dominate the conversation, and I don't want to do that today because this is an important issue. So I want to focus primarily on holding the federal government responsible or accountable for the loss of our languages, for the devastation that took place since contact. I hope that there's some time towards the end for me to talk a little bit about some of the history that all the tribes in Washington State have been working on with regard to language preservation, maintenance, and revitalization since 2000. And so I'm just going to quickly go into some of the things that I think are important to mention with regard to ANA language grant funding. As you all know, we want to hold the federal government responsible by providing mandatory funding to all tribes for language preservation, maintenance, and revitalization, and with no strings attached. Part of the strings, as you all are aware of, require annual reporting, such as financial and narrative reporting, and hopefully that would no longer be an issue or a requirement. The other thing is when programs develop, regardless of it's a language program or any other program that receives federal funding, you're required to put the grant number on all of the materials that you develop. And that's the federal government's way of exercising their copyright on those documents. And so what the language program did at Colville was we refused to put that number on all of the products that were produced by the fluent speaking elders. Those products were primarily the documentation of the languages and cultures, stories, songs, the cosmology, the natural resources, the seasons, every aspect of our lives they documented. We also conducted research in various libraries, museums, NARA, the Seattle branch, and in DC. And so when we gathered that information, or as much information as we could, we put all of that information, including all the documents that the fluent-speaking elders produced, in a language library. So it's important, and I'm sure that there are other tribes that have done something similar, where you document everything and then you store it so that you have it available for not only for your current use, but for future uses, for your younger generations to have access to, because as we all know that a lot of our information has been documented, but in some cases many of it's not correct. And so it's important that we get that information from our fluent speaking elders. And so at Colville we did that. Over the years, a lot of those language the library materials produced by the language elders has gone missing. But we were smart in that we not only created a language library, but we also sent everything to the archives. So I was the language manager hired on December 19, 2000, and I was also the assistant archivist. In 2001, the tribe decided not to split the two programs and to keep them together, and so I was the manager of both programs, and since then had become the archivist for the tribe. And as a trained historian, I thought it was important that we continue to send that documentation archives for future use, for our future generations, to have access to all that language material. So in looking at and mandating language funding for all tribes, we need to keep in mind that those libraries, tribal libraries, are important for maintaining, preserving, and revitalizing your language programs. For those tribes that don't have language programs, we would definitely want to make sure that they receive funding also, so that they can work on preserving, maintaining, and revitalizing their languages. And so I just wanted to bring that up. But one of the things that I want to talk to after I get another chance, hopefully, is about, like I said, some of the work that was done by tribes here in Washington State. And we did that work together. And we accomplished a lot. And a lot of people don't know about that work. People think that the latest work done by tribes, is new, and that that there's no history behind that information. There's a lot of history. And there are a lot of elders that took a lot of their time and effort to work with us on Washington administrative codes, bills that were done in the early 2000s that brought us up to where we are today. And some of the leaders are in the room today. Their elders did a lot of that work. And so I'll bring that up later. But the other thing that I wanted to mention, because Josh brought this up, when I was in the language program within a few months after starting and having the opportunity to work with the elders, you start dreaming in the languages. We have 3 languages that we were preserving, maintaining, and revitalizing at Colville. And we employed over 50 elders in each of the languages to work on documenting their stories, the words, the phrases, the cosmology, the seasons, the natural resource, everything and anything that they could think of, they were documenting it. At the same time, as an archivist, I would record a lot of the storytelling because it's important to get those videos of them. Some of the elders were not willing to be filmed, but they were allowing me to at least record their stories. So I just wanted to mention that, and I'll go ahead and stop there because I think Jefferson, Jefferson needs to still speak. Thank you.
Well, Josh has indicated he doesn't have any additional remarks. Just hearing some of the panelists, we can talk a little bit about some of the stuff that was raised, but I guess I had one or a couple of questions for the panel. I guess, just especially for the uninitiated, could you maybe talk about what kind of resources your tribal language programs or tribal language programs that you're familiar with, what kind of funding they receive, whether it be from the federal government through competitive grants or state funding or whatever the tribe contributes? Can folks just maybe go around and describe that a little bit? Because I think that would be helpful to put some of this in context.
Sure, I'd be happy to go. Thank you. I appreciate our tribe has invested an incredible amount into language revitalization. I know when I was working there one summer, we had a staff of 25, and we were doing all kinds of camps and programs and classes. We have 3 languages on the Warm Springs Reservation: the Paiute language, Wasco language, and the Sahaptin Nitchishkin language. And each of them are staffed at different levels. In Nitchishkin, we have 7 speakers that are still living with us today. The Paiute have 2 speakers, and then sadly the Kiksh, one of our last grandmas, passed away, I believe, in 2012. So the tribe has invested a lot and still investing. And thanks to our leadership in our language department, they've raised $2 million to support language revitalization. So right now we've gotten money from the Meyer Memorial Trust, the Collins Foundation. Of course, we've gotten an ANA grant, and those are commendable funding sources. I want to also put out there that I would really like to see more of our funders be have a relationship with us. I know that some of us don't want to have anybody giving us a call, even if it's just once a month or once a quarter, to say hello, just checking on you. There's been a lot of times that we get dollars and we'll never ever hear from a funder again, and that probably works for some folks, but there's times that I think it'd really be helpful for us to be able to say, we're doing really great, but we are short here, we are short there, that we ought to be okay with expressing our shortfalls. I think we also need to be comfortable with assessing our programs, not just our students, but our teachers and the program itself, that we have to be okay if we don't hit our benchmarks. If we didn't hit it, why didn't we hit it? And being okay with setting those even at a teacher level, like, okay, if you plan on getting this student to be a novice level in this language, how are you going to get there? And did you get there? And if you didn't get there, we're not going to fire you. We're not here to get rid of you. We just want to make sure that we're able to support our teachers. I think a lot of times we have a turnover in Indian country because our people don't feel supported in the classroom or even in the office. And we need to keep our people, we're already investing into our people, we need to keep them working for the tribe. There's so much talent that has walked out of the door because sometimes their idea wasn't implemented. And every single idea comes comes with a cost. And we have to also remind our folks that every idea is an idea. There's ones that are costly, there's ones that are very efficient, and there's some that are we've tried in the past, and to revisit those, that also comes at a cost. And so I would also encourage us to get more young folks involved in ATNI. When we have these ATNIs in different communities, that we want to introduce them to the initiatives that we're doing on a regional basis, if not national. I went to a language conference back in 2013, and I heard one of our grandmas speak who had been devoted 55 years of her life to language revitalization. And after she spoke, I went and talked to her. I said, I'm going to do this forever. I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. And I've never left. And so I'd like to see more people coming to these conferences as well. And so, but I just want to say that about donors was the question, and funders, that we'd really like to have more partnerships rather than just the money, in my opinion. Thank you.
Our funding generally comes from the ANA grants, but as you know, with several of our federal funding, it's like a bonus thrown out to the tribes, and then we have to fight over the different funding that we can get for any of our programs. But we have our ANA grants, and we also have our Avista funding, which when we won the Lake case for the atrocities that the tribe had suffered, Avista does pay our tribes a payment every year, and with that payment, it goes towards our culture and our language for what we had lost because of the lake. And so that funding goes towards our language and our students that are working on computerizing our language. We also have a teacher at our Early Childhood Learning Center. All of that is paid with tribal funding. We have a teacher at our local public school at the high school, and that also is paid for by our tribal funding. So all in all, just to get our teachers out there to teach, for our people to learn the language, it's not hitting our families directly, indirectly through our ECLC programs, through the little ones, but when the little children in ECLC or in tribal school or in our public schools learn the language and they take it home, their parents don't understand the language. So we're working on programs so that we can have an all-around program for all of our families and all of those that work in our tribal offices learn the language also. But with our tribe, and I know several others, we're all suffering from additional funding being required to try to follow through with these objectives. Lim Lynch.
Guess I'm next. So, like everybody else, we received an ANA grant. It took us, due to the competitiveness of the grant, it took us 10 years to finally get one. The tribe established a language program in 1992 with a Forest Service grant, very, very small. It only allowed a couple of people to be hired. And the tribe used a lot of their own funding over the years. 106 fluent-speaking elders were identified as fluent-speaking elders when the language program was formed in 1992. Since then, we're down to a handful. And keep in mind, we have 3 languages we're still trying to preserve, maintain, and revitalize. At this effort, at this time, we're really struggling because of the funding issues. We have received funding from some other outside sources like philanthropic organizations, but the funding is not enough. It's hard enough to receive or look for funding for one language, but to find funding for all three is even harder. But it's something that the tribe has invested in, and we will continue to invest in it, and having or requiring the federal government to provide mandatory funding would go a significant way, not only for, like I said, for those with one language, but those others that have more than one language. And for those tribes that don't have language programs, this would be significant to assist them in language preservation. For those that don't have them, that preservation piece will be very expensive, but it's necessary to conduct that research, to recover as much information about your languages and cultures as you can. As you all are aware, you can't have language without culture and vice versa. And so it's important that you also look at that. One of the things that I didn't mention and forgot the first time I spoke was that those federal requirements that we currently have to adhere to, in some cases require a match, a financial match, instead of an in-kind. And so getting rid of that requirement would be good. If we can get the mandatory funding that we all really want as a result of the loss of our languages due to not only the boarding schools and the assimilationist policies, but that trauma that was created, that trauma that we've all experienced since contact. And so that funding will go a long ways to help us in other ways, to help us in our healing. I'm a product of the boarding school system. I'm a survivor of the boarding school system. At Colville, the St. Mary's Mission School was put into place in a relationship between the Catholic Church and the federal government. So the church received funding to carry out the federal government's assimilationist policies. And so a lot of children, including myself, were abused. And dealing with that healing is hard. I had a short conversation with Lisa from Lummi yesterday, and and we were talking about triggers. And I told her, those of us on council that suffered some of that abuse, we're healing, but you have triggers. You can have them at any time. And so it can be difficult, but we're doing really good, right? Some of the survivors are doing really good and some aren't. And one of the things that a lot of survivors deal with is that loss of language and culture, that loss of connection and feeling like they belong. And so those people need a lot of help. And so that mandatory funding would not only deal with language loss, but would also deal with healing and providing that much needed healing for all of them. And so I wanted to mention that. The funding could also include resources for immersion schools. At Colville, there are 3 immersion schools related to Colville. So there's one in Spokane, the Salish School of Spokane, the Inchlim Language House in Inchlim, and the Waterfall School in Omak. The Waterfall School, the main person that created that immersion school, was one of the teacher trainees that came out of the ATNI grant that we received in 2003. She was an attorney working for the tribe, and she was so invested in learning the language, the Inselk'chin language, that she quit her job as an attorney and financially struggled because she was so immersed in the language and culture, and that continues to be her goal. And they're looking at building a new facility, trying to raise money to build their own school. Right now they're in borrowed space. But the work that they're doing is significant, as is the work all the other immersion schools are doing. The last thing that mandatory funding could cover is outdoor classrooms. More and more tribes are creating outdoor classrooms, and that's important for providing cultural activities with the language. And so that's another piece that I wanted to mention. Thank you.
I believe in the past, Cowlitz has had some ANA grants to help with little things here and there like books, but right now it's funded just internally. Having more federal funding, I think, would be really great to help expand the program to the size of other programs that are in the tribe, because right now the program's just me. But I'm hearing about these programs that have 50 elders employed per language. So getting federal funding, I think we would definitely need that to take this language program to the next level, the level of having a lot of more fluent speakers, newly fluent speakers. Thank you.
I had one more question for the panel, but before I get to that, I just want to know if there's anything else that other panelists want to talk about that they haven't had a chance to raise yet, or based on what they've heard from the other panelists so far. I think, Karen, you had mentioned that you had some additional material you wanted to cover. So maybe before we run out of time, I just wanted to make sure you got that opportunity for folks.
Sure, I wouldn't mind. I thank you for bringing up the learning styles. All of our youth, they have very different learning styles, and I started to realize that when I was in a language classroom, that if I had seen it written on a board and I can write it myself, that I had the higher ability to retain the language. And my language stuck with me, and so I started encouraging our youth to read and write our language, which is actually opposite than some elders. I've actually had elders excuse me from their classroom because of the note-taking I was doing at that time. But years later, they saw how far I had progressed because I was able to take the language home and study it even after 5 o'clock. And I really appreciated in the language department, too, that our director would encourage us to go out and walk, even on breaks and at lunches, and reminding us that our language efforts for revitalization was only as strong as our workforce. And if our workforce was not as healthy, then a language also wasn't as healthy. If our people aren't having longevity and long life expectancies, then our language was as healthy as our workforce. As far as documentation and archiving, that was, there's different parts to language revitalization. There's language preservation and there's language revitalization. Preservation is when you document and archive and you put it away, and hopefully those archives and documentations are living and accessible to the tribal membership and community. What I had noticed that there's a lot of times that our tribes put our information that our elders have shared with our tribal government, they lock them and they keep them away from some of our own very membership. And so that inspired me to have a living archive and documentation spot for our community to access. That way they can hear their own grandmas speaking while they're even still here, and to be able to be inspired by the words that our elders share that are still with us today. Sometimes we think that, there's nobody else to interview, they're all gone. But you'll be surprised of how many people that are still within our community that still have so much information to share. Like, I know some Warm Springers in here that are still my teachers because of who their grandmas were and who their grandpas were. And I really appreciate us relying on each other and remembering that even if some of our folks don't speak the language, that they still have those teachings that are still able to still come about. And last but not least, when I had started to becoming a teacher, I got a teaching license from the state of Oregon, and I taught in public schools for 2 years, the Ichishkin language. And I think within the first month, I wanted to be the student's favorite teacher. And so I would go back to work, I'd work on my material, and I'd get back to class, I'd test something out, I'd have fun, I'd engage with them, and I always wanted to be their favorite teacher. And in essence, some would interpret that, well, do you want to be the best? Yeah, I want to be the best teacher. I want to be my best teacher for my students. And so I would just work at that. How can I make this engaging? How can I make this class memorable? Their parents are going to ask when they get home, what did you learn from Teacher Green today? And I want them to say, oh my gosh, we did this and we did that and we have fun and I can say this and now I can say that. And I think a lot of us have to have that same attitude, that you have to be the very best that you can. And if it makes you the best, then so be it. And in relation to what I saw the panel is, sometimes our tribes are pitted against each other for these federal dollars. What if one of these tribes stepped up and said, you know what, we're gonna ask the federal government for millions of dollars because we are the best. We are the best at revitalizing our language, and we are the best at doing this job, and we're the best candidate for getting all that money, so I guess so be it. We're trying to be the very best. And so I would encourage our tribes and language departments to have that mentality. It is just the world that we live in. We're going after white man type of money, then we better play the white man's game. And so I don't mean that with any offense, but that's just the world that we live in. Things are getting very tight, things are getting very short, and if it takes our ability to assess how well we're doing, then so be it, and be okay with the results. But we're not trying to kick anybody out the door, but be okay with the results. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and give a quick history of some of the work that the tribes in Washington State have been doing since the late 1990s. In 1998, a grassroots organization was formed by the tribes in Washington State. In 1999, they called themselves the First Peoples Language Culture Committee. And the reason why they decided to do that, and the reason why they were a grassroots organization, is they didn't want to formalize and exclude anybody from this important work. And so even till up to today, that organization is still a grassroots organization that has not formalized. In 2001, or in 1999, after giving themselves a name, they began working earnestly on trying to figure out how to best train, certify our own language culture teachers. And at some point in 2000, tribes started working with Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. And on November 30th, 2000, at a meeting at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, the tribe presented a draft of a proposed WAC, Washington Administrative Code, to OSPI. And OSPI was kind of hesitant at first to consider that tribes had the ability to train and certify their own teachers, their own language teachers. But in the spring of 2001, they agreed that they would form a subcommittee that worked with a subcommittee of FPLC. And again, remember, FPLC consisted of all tribes in Washington, including Coeur d'Alene. Even though Coeur d'Alene's not in Washington, Coeur d'Alene was the only tribe outside of Washington that was involved. I don't know why. I'm not going to go into politics or any of that. But I have documentation that shows that Coeur d'Alene's the only outside Washington State tribe that participated in these meetings. And at OMAC in September of 2001, we held another meeting. Well, we were meeting regularly, but there was this meeting that took a turn in OMAC where we kept pushing the colleges and universities to stay out of our business with regard to training and certifying our teachers. And in January of 2001, at a meeting at Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, they were nice enough to let us use one of their meeting spaces because my sister worked there. It was another turning point in terms of tribes coming together to push the colleges and universities to stay out of our business. We proceeded to meet with OSPI the subcommittees decided to work with OSPI subcommittee on the draft of WAC 180-78A-700. That draft was accepted and formalized by OSPI on January 15th, 2003. A hearing was held at their quarterly meeting in Olympia, and we were given about 20, 30 minutes to testify on behalf of the bill. We invited everybody that we could in Washington State and outside to attend this hearing. And I don't know if any of you have attended some of those meetings, but they're held in small rooms. And we took over the whole room, and we held a celebration, and they gave us an hour. And we knew that OSPI was going to adopt this WAC. The WAC is the First Peoples Language Culture Teacher Certification WAC. 180-78A-700. It passed out of committee on January 15, 2003, and on January 17th, OSPI adopted the WAC. That night at Skokomish, at their smokehouse, we held a huge celebration. OSPI was invited, and all the tribes brought something to give away, so there was a potlatch. The youth at Skok served everybody, and we filled the whole room. And I don't know if there's anybody here in the room besides myself that was at that celebration or participated in any of those meetings. And that's okay if you didn't, because your elders did. Pauline Hilaire from Lemmy, Virginia Beavert, Patsy from Yakima, Pauline Flett from Spokane, Elaine Emerson from Colville. I could go on and on and on, but I don't have time. There's 5 minutes left. But what I wanted to let you all know is that we all worked together and we all struggled together and we all talked about primarily the elders, because this was about the elders who were pushing the work that we all did to preserve, maintain, and revitalize our languages. And so those couple of years were amazing. And to gather that many people with tribal council support, because at this time, councils were just giving their language managers approval to participate in these meetings. They didn't control anybody. They just said, just keep giving, well, at Colville anyway. I don't know about anybody else. But at Colville, they told me, as a language manager, just go do what you need to do and get it done. Give us, updates when you can. And if you need our help, let us know. After the WAC was passed, we realized that tribal leaders need to be involved. And so we formed the Tribal Leaders Congress on Education. That was the formalized piece of the work that we did. That's where TLC came from, was the work that all of your elders did, all of your language managers did. 2003, the same time that this work was being done, John McCoy was elected to the Washington State Legislature, and he became our biggest advocate. In 2007, FPLC continued to do work with all the tribes, and we proposed a bill that would mandate all public schools in Washington State teach our history. And the Washington State Legislature said, no, we can't tell school districts what to do. So they changed the language and put in encourage. Since then, tribes have continued to work on bills that would mandate the teaching of our tribal history in the local school districts. And we got that, right? We got that. We got the ability to teach since time immemorial, curriculum in the school districts. And so that work that we all did, that all your elders did, brought us to where we are today. And I thought it was important that I include that, or that I share that information with all of you, because that's part of your history. That's part of the history work. That's part of that language work that your elders and your language managers at the time did. And keep in mind, some of those people that worked in your language programs were younger. So some of the younger ones that we had in the program at the beginning they don't consider themselves fluent. They consider themselves semi-fluent. but they've been with the program for years. And they're the most knowledgeable and humble, yet respected and